I am standing right there in the middle of our living room, but I might as well be a ghost. The air is thick with the smell of expensive coffee and the sound of polite laughter. My parents are hosting a group of new neighbors, people they want to impress. I'm holding a tray of small snacks, waiting for a moment to set them down. One of the guests, a kind-looking woman in a yellow dress, looks up and catches my eye. She smiles at me, then turns to my mother. "What a lovely home you have," the woman says. "And tell me, do you have any children?" My mother doesn't hesitate. She doesn't even blink. She just sets her teacup down with a delicate click and beams with pride. "Just one," she says, her voice as smooth as silk. "Our son, Adrian. He's the light of our lives." I freeze. The tray in my hands feels like it weighs 100 pounds. I am exactly 3 feet away from her. I am looking directly at her face, but she is looking right through me. My father nods in agreement, taking a sip of his drink. He doesn't correct her. He doesn't mention my name. I slowly step back into the shadows of the hallway, feeling my heart shrink. It is like I was never there at all. This isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, it has become the routine of my entire life. Being invisible isn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow fading, like a photograph left out in the sun for too long. At school events, my parents would sit in the front row to cheer for Adrian during his soccer games, but they never showed up for my debate tournaments or art shows. When we went to family gatherings, they would introduce Adrian to every cousin and great-aunt, but I was always just the girl standing behind them, the one they forgot to name. Even at church, where everyone is supposed to be seen, I was a shadow. If I tried to speak up during dinner, my father would start a conversation with Adrian right over my voice. If I stayed quiet, they seemed relieved, as if my silence made the house feel more organized. I stopped trying to be loud a long time ago. I learned how to walk without making the floorboards creak. I learned how to breathe, so softly that no one would notice the air moving. I lived in a house full of people, yet I was completely and utterly alone. My existence was a secret they didn't even bother to keep. They just ignored it until it became true. Adrian wasn't just their favorite child. He was the only one they allowed to exist in the eyes of the world. He was 2 years older than me, athletic, charismatic, and exactly what they wanted in a son. Our hallway was a gallery of his life. There were photos of him as a baby, photos of his first day of school, and framed jerseys from his championship games. There wasn't a single picture of me. Not one. It was as if I hadn't been born, or as if I was a guest who had stayed too long and worn out my welcome. Whenever my parents told stories to their friends about their only child, they talked about Adrian's grades or his future goals. I used to try to jump in. I used to say, "Wait, I'm here too." But the looks they gave me were so cold and confused that it hurt worse than being ignored. Eventually, I just gave up. When teachers or neighbors asked, "Oh, you're an only child too?" I would just nod and look at my shoes. It was easier to accept their lie than to fight for a truth that nobody wanted to hear. I was the replacement that was never needed, the extra part in a machine that functioned perfectly without me. The day I turned 18 should have been special. It was the bridge to adulthood, the day I finally became legal. But when I woke up that morning, the house was silent. There were no balloons, no happy birthday banners, and definitely no cake on the kitchen table. My mother was busy packing lunch for Adrian, who was heading off to summer practice. My father was reading the newspaper. Neither of them looked up when I walked into the room. I spent the whole day waiting for a phone call or a simple text message, but my phone remained dark and silent. That night, I was sitting on the stairs in the dark, unable to sleep. I heard the low murmur of my parents' voices coming from the kitchen. I leaned in, hoping maybe they were planning a surprise for the next day. "We've done enough for her," I heard my father say. His voice was cold, final. "She's 18 now. She'll figure things out on her own. We need to focus on getting Adrian into the best university. That's where our future is." My mother sighed, a sound of pure agreement. "You're right. It's better this way." Something inside me didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The tiny spark of hope I had been carrying died right then and there. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or run into the kitchen to demand an explanation. Instead, I went back to my room and pulled a single dusty bag from under my bed. I didn't have much, just a few sets of clothes, some books I'd saved up for, and a little bit of money I'd hidden away from odd jobs. I packed quietly, my movements steady and sure. I didn't want a confrontation because I knew a confrontation required two people to acknowledge each other, and they had already proven they wouldn't acknowledge me. There was no need for a big goodbye to people who wouldn't even realize I was gone. As the sun began to peek over the horizon the next morning, I stood at the front door. My hand trembled slightly on the doorknob. I waited for just a moment, a foolish part of me hoping that one of them would wake up, walk down the hall, and ask me where I was going. I waited for a hand on my shoulder or a voice calling my name. But the house remained still. The only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hallway. No one came. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool morning air. I shut the door behind me with a soft click and walked away without looking back. The first few months were a blur of survival. I found a tiny, cramped apartment in a part of the city I had never visited before. The walls were thin, and the heater rattled all night, but it was mine. I didn't have a safety net or a bank account filled by my parents. I had to work 2 part-time jobs just to keep the lights on. During the day, I washed dishes at a busy diner, and at night, I cleaned office buildings. My feet ached, and my hands were constantly chapped from the soapy water, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually standing on solid ground. I kept my phone on for the first week, checking it every hour. I expected a flurry of missed calls once they realized my room was empty. I expected a police report or at least a panicked text from my mother. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the silence remained absolute. Not once did they check if I was alive. Not once did they ask where I had gone. It was as if I had simply evaporated, and they were perfectly happy with the extra space in the house. I was truly starting from nothing, a person with no history and no family, building a life out of thin air. While working at the diner, I saw a flyer for a media internship at a local production company. They were looking for someone to help with basic tasks, filing papers, getting coffee, and keeping the studio tidy. I didn't know anything about media, but I knew how to be quiet and observant. I applied, and to my surprise, I got the job. I spent my days in the background of busy sets, watching how stories were put together. I watched the way the cameras moved and how the editors sliced film to create emotion. Because I was so used to being invisible, I noticed things that others missed. I saw the small patterns in how people talked, the hidden stories in the way a street corner looked at sunset, and the unique angles that made a boring interview look like a masterpiece. I started taking notes in a small leather journal. I didn't show them to anyone at first. I just watched and learned. For the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of belonging. The people at the office didn't know my past, and they didn't care about my family. They just saw a hard worker who was always there when they needed her. For the first time, I felt seen, even if it was just as the girl who gets the coffee. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I had left my notebook open on a desk while I went to fetch a stack of scripts. When I returned, a senior editor named Julian was leaning over it, his brow furrowed in concentration. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was sure I was about to get in trouble for writing on company time. I walked up slowly, my voice small. "I'm sorry, I'll move that," I whispered. Julian didn't look angry, though. He looked surprised. He pointed to a page where I had mapped out a storyboard for a documentary about the city's forgotten alleyways. "You wrote this?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I gave a small, hesitant nod, prepared for him to tell me it was garbage. He studied the page for a long minute, then looked back at me. He didn't see a coffee girl, he saw a creator. "These angles are incredible," he said. "You have a very strange way of seeing the world, like you're looking from the outside in. It's unique." He didn't hand the book back immediately. Instead, he tapped his pen against the desk. "Stay late tomorrow," he said firmly. "I want to show you how to use the editing software. You have an eye for this, kid. Don't waste it." The next few months were a whirlwind of learning. Julian became my mentor, teaching me the language of film and storytelling. I started helping with small segments, short clips for the local news or social media updates for the company. One night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. working on a 3-minute video about a homeless musician who played in the subway. I focused on the details, the way his fingers moved over the strings, the reflection of the passing trains in his eyes, and the sound of his breath between notes. It was a story about someone who felt ignored by the world, just like I had. We posted the video on the company's website the next morning. By noon, it had 1,000 views. By the next day, it had 100,000. By the end of the week, it had gone viral across the entire country. People were moved to tears by the raw honesty of the piece. They wanted to know who had filmed it. Because I was just an intern, my name wasn't in the credits, and no one knew I was the one behind the camera. But it didn't matter. I knew. I sat in my tiny apartment, watching the view count climb, and I felt a warmth in my chest I had never known. I didn't need their praise, I just needed to know that I existed. I didn't let the success go to my head. Instead, I used it as fuel to work even harder. I moved up quickly, going from a silent assistant to a junior producer. I became known as the person who could find the heart in any story, no matter how small. I was the creative lead behind some of our biggest features, but I still chose to stay behind the scenes. I didn't have a social media presence. I didn't post selfies or talk about my personal life. I let the work speak for itself. My parents were still a distant, fading memory. Every now and then, I would wonder if they had seen my work, but I knew they wouldn't recognize it as mine. To them, I was still the girl who couldn't do anything right, the one who was less than Adrian. I had built a whole world for myself in the city, far away from the house that felt like a prison. My colleagues respected me, my boss trusted me, and I was finally earning enough money to live comfortably. I was building my life silently, brick by brick, making sure the foundation was strong enough that no one could ever make me feel invisible again. I was becoming someone, even if the world didn't know my name yet. Inside the company, I became a bit of a mystery. Because I never shared my last name or talked about where I came from, the other producers started calling me Lena. It wasn't my real name, but I didn't correct them. In a way, Lena was a different person than the girl who had walked out of that house on her 18th birthday. Lena was confident. Lena was talented. Lena was a leader. I liked being Lena. It was a shield that kept my past from catching up with me. Clients would come in asking for the Lena touch on their projects. They didn't care about my background. They just wanted results. I became a ghost in the industry, someone everyone knew of, but no one truly knew. I was used to being unknown, so it didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. The more I stayed in the shadows, the more I could focus on the people whose stories I was telling. I was the invisible hand that moved the camera, the silent voice that shaped the narrative. I had turned my greatest pain, my invisibility, into my greatest strength. I was finally in control of my own image, even if that image was a blank space. One morning, our CEO called a meeting to announce our biggest project yet. We were going to produce a high-budget documentary series about the hidden hearts of various small towns across the state. My heart stopped when I saw the first town on the list. It was my hometown, the place where I had been erased, the place where my parents and Adrian still lived. My first instinct was to say no, to run as far away from that assignment as possible. But then, a spark of curiosity flared up in me. I wanted to see what had changed. I returned to my hometown with a small film crew, acting as the lead producer. I wore dark sunglasses and a baseball cap, keeping my head down as we scouted locations. The streets looked exactly the same. The park where I used to hide was still there. The diner where Adrian's soccer team used to celebrate was still bustling with noise. Nothing had changed about the town, but as I looked at my reflection in a shop window, I realized that everything had changed about me. I wasn't that scared, silent girl anymore. I was a professional with a job to do. I was back in their world, but I was a stranger now. On the third day of filming, I was standing on the sidewalk checking some light meter readings. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw two familiar figures walking toward me. It was them. My mother was wearing a new floral coat, and my father was carrying a bag of groceries. They were laughing and talking, looking like the perfect, happy couple. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, I felt like I was 8 years old again, desperate for them to look at me. They walked right past me. They didn't recognize me. They didn't even give me a second glance. To them, I was just another member of a film crew blocking the sidewalk. I watched them walk away, my heart thumping painfully against my ribs. I told myself it shouldn't hurt anymore. I told myself I was over them. But the sting of being a stranger to your own parents is a sharp, cold knife. I realized then that they hadn't just forgotten me, they had deleted the very memory of me. I stood there for a long time, watching the back of my father's head until they turned the corner. It was the final proof that I truly didn't exist in their world. When we got back to the studio, the marketing team decided we needed a new national campaign to launch the series. They wanted it to be about resilience, about people who had faced invisible struggles and come out stronger on the other side. They interviewed dozens of models and actors, but none of them felt right. Our creative director, a woman who had become a close friend, kept looking at me during the auditions. One afternoon, she called me into her office and shut the door. "Lena," she said, her voice soft but serious, "I've watched you for years. I've seen how you look at the world. I think you're the face we've been looking for. I want you to be the representative for this campaign." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "Me? No, I'm a producer. I stay behind the camera," I argued, but she wouldn't back down. "The campaign is about being seen," she said. "Your story, whatever it is that makes you so quiet and so strong, matters. It's written all over your face. People will connect with it because it's real." I spent the whole night pacing my apartment, torn between the safety of my shadows and the terrifying light of the truth. I refused at first. The idea of my face being on billboards and TV screens made my stomach turn. I had spent years staying hidden, building a life where no one could find me. If I did this, the wall I had built around myself would come crumbling down. My boss called me into his office and showed me some of the footage we had captured of the people in the documentary. "Look at them, Lena," he said. "They are brave enough to show their faces. Why aren't you?" He was right. I was being a hypocrite. I was telling other people's stories of bravery while I was hiding from my own. I thought about all the kids out there who felt like ghosts in their own homes, the ones who were being told they didn't matter. "If I do this," I said, my voice trembling, "I want to tell the truth. I don't want to act. I want to tell my story." My boss smiled and nodded. "That's exactly what we want." I took a deep breath and signed the contract. I was finally stepping out of the shadows, and there was no going back. The day of the shoot was the most intense experience of my life. Instead of being the one behind the monitor, I was the one sitting in the chair under the hot, bright lights. There were cameras everywhere, capturing every blink and every breath. The director didn't give me a script. He just asked me questions about my life, about what it felt like to be ignored, and about how I found the strength to keep going. I told my story, carefully, without using my parents' names, but I didn't hold back the emotion. I talked about the birthday with no cake. I talked about the living room where I was a ghost. I talked about the long nights of working 2 jobs and the cold silence of a phone that never rang. For the first time, I wasn't just observing a story, I was the story. I felt a strange sense of relief as the words left my mouth. It was like I was finally exhaling a breath I had been holding for 18 years. When the director finally called cut, the entire crew was silent. Some of them were wiping tears from their eyes. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine, it was a story that many people carried in their hearts. The campaign launched nationwide a month later. It was bigger than anything the company had ever done. My face was on massive billboards in Times Square, on the sides of buses, and in full-page ads in major magazines. The TV commercial played during the most popular shows. It was a close-up of my face, looking directly into the camera, while my voice narrated the journey from invisibility to strength. The tagline was simple: "You were seen." The reaction was instant. The campaign went viral, and the girl in the ad became a topic of conversation everywhere. People started sharing their own stories of being overlooked or abandoned. I stayed away from the news at first, focusing on my work at the studio. I didn't think about my parents seeing it. In my mind, they lived in a different universe, one where I didn't exist. I didn't think about them sitting in their living room, turning on the TV, and seeing the daughter they had erased staring back at them with a look of absolute power. I didn't think about it, not yet. Back in my small hometown, the atmosphere was changing. People who had known me as a quiet, shadow-like girl were starting to whisper. They saw the billboards near the highway and the ads on their local news. At the grocery store, people stopped to look at the magazine covers. "Isn't that the girl who lived on Oak Street?" they asked. The one the parents said was an only child. The secret they had kept for years was starting to unravel in the light of day. In my parents' house, the TV was always on in the background. One evening, my father was sitting in his usual chair, and my mother was folding laundry. The commercial started. My face filled the screen, larger than life and more beautiful than they had ever seen me. The room went silent. The only sound was the voice they hadn't heard in years, speaking clearly and with conviction. They both froze, their eyes locked on the screen. For the first time in their lives, they couldn't look away. They recognized the shape of my eyes, the curve of my jaw, and the sound of my voice. They finally saw me. "That's not her," my father said quickly, his voice harsh and forced. He stood up and grabbed the remote, switching the channel as if he could erase the image by changing the station. He paced the room, his face turning a bright, angry red. "It's just a look-alike. Some actress they hired. Our daughter wouldn't be on a national campaign. She's probably working some dead-end job somewhere." He was trying to build the wall back up, trying to protect the lie he had lived for so long. But my mother didn't speak. She didn't agree with him this time. She sat on the sofa, her hands trembling as she held a half-folded shirt. She knew. She remembered the way I used to look at her, hoping for a crumb of affection. She remembered the day I disappeared and how she had chosen not to call the police. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy with the weight of everything they had ignored. My father kept talking, trying to convince himself, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The girl on the TV was too real to be denied. That night, while my father slept, my mother did something she hadn't done in years. She went to the computer and typed my name into a search engine. She found the campaign website and clicked on the extended interview. She sat there in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes, and she listened to every word I said. She heard me talk about the only child lie. She heard me talk about the pain of being a ghost. She saw the credits at the end of the video, produced and directed by Lena. There was no doubt left. The girl on the screen was her daughter, the one she had allowed to be erased. She saw the awards I had won and the articles written about my genius for storytelling. She realized that while they had been focusing all their energy on Adrian, who was currently struggling through a job he didn't like, I had built an empire out of the scraps they had left me. She sat there for hours, watching the videos over and over again until the sun began to rise. The truth was out, and it was more brilliant and painful than she could have ever imagined. For the first time in years, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but I knew the area code. It was my hometown. I was sitting in my office, looking out at the city skyline when the screen lit up. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I didn't pick it up. I watched the phone vibrate on my desk until it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a notification popped up. A new message. I clicked it, my heart pounding. "Honey, it's Mom. We saw the news. We saw you. Please, we need to talk." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button. I felt a surge of anger, then a wave of sadness, and finally, a strange sense of emptiness. They were calling me honey now? Now that I was successful? Now that the whole world knew my face? I didn't reply. I put the phone in my drawer and went back to work. I let it ring again an hour later. And again that evening. I let it ring until the battery died. I wasn't that girl waiting by the door anymore. Eventually, I realized that I needed to face them to truly move on. I didn't want to carry the weight of their silence into my future. I agreed to meet them, but only on my terms. I chose a neutral place, a busy coffee shop in the city, far away from their house. I arrived early and sat at a table near the window watching the door. When they walked in, they looked smaller than I remembered. They looked older, more tired, and completely out of place in my world. When they saw me, they stopped in their tracks. They didn't know how to act. My mother reached out as if to hug me, but I stayed seated, keeping a polite distance. My father looked around at the bustling shop, his eyes wide with confusion. "You look different," he stammered, taking a seat across from me. "You look like a professional." I didn't smile. I just looked at them with the same neutral expression I used in business meetings. I wasn't there to be their daughter. I was there to be a witness to the truth. The power dynamic had shifted completely. My father tried to explain himself first. He cleared his throat and looked at his hands. "We thought you wanted space," he said, his voice shaky. "We thought you were unhappy at home and that you needed to find your own way. We didn't want to interfere." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, but I kept it down. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice calm and steady. "You didn't think I wanted space," I said. "You didn't think about me at all. You erased me because I didn't fit the image of the perfect family you wanted to show the world." The silence that followed was deafening. My father opened his mouth to argue, but he couldn't find the words. He knew I was right. He knew that every time they told people they only had one child, they were killing a piece of me. I was 3 feet away from you, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I was right there and you looked through me. You didn't give me space, you gave me a vacuum. They sat there, stunned by the cold clarity of my words. I wasn't screaming, I was just stating facts. My mother finally broke down. She began to cry, thick, heavy sobs that made people at the other tables turn to look. We didn't know how to connect with you, she whispered through her tears. You were always so quiet, so different from Adrian. We didn't know what to say. I nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of pity for her, but not enough to change my mind. You didn't try, I said simply. Connection takes effort. It takes looking at someone and seeing who they really are, not who you want them to be. I realized then that they were just ordinary, flawed people who had made a terrible mistake. They weren't monsters, they were just cowards. They had chosen the easy lie over the difficult truth, and they had lost a daughter because of it. I'm not angry anymore, I told them. Anger requires a connection, and we don't have one. I just wanted you to know that I'm doing fine. I'm more than fine. I'm seen by millions of people now, but more importantly, I finally see myself. I stood up, leaving my coffee untouched. There was nothing left to say. Weeks later, my campaign won a prestigious national award for Best Social Impact Media. I stood on a stage in a grand ballroom, wearing a beautiful dress, and surrounded by the most talented people in the industry. As I held the heavy trophy in my hands, I looked out at the audience. This award is for anyone who has ever felt invisible, I said into the microphone. For the ones who were told they didn't matter, and the ones who were erased. You are not a ghost. You are real, and your story is worth telling. I didn't look for my parents in the crowd. I knew they weren't there, and for the first time I didn't care. I didn't need them to see me to know that I existed. They had seen my face on the TV, on the billboards, and in that coffee shop, but they had seen it too late. I was no longer waiting for their approval, or their love. I had found my own voice and built my own family out of the people who truly saw me. As I walked off the stage, I felt light, free, and completely visible. I was finally home, and the door was wide open.